She left me a handwritten note. 6 years. 6 years of my life. My savings, my career, my apartment in another city, every birthday, every holiday, every 3 a.m. emergency. And what I got was a folded piece of paper tucked inside an envelope with my name spelled wrong. It said, "You were always just temporary." I read it standing in the hallway of the house I had lived in for 6 years. The house I had repaired the roof of. The house where I had learned to cook the meals she could still eat after her second surgery. The house that was, as of 48 hours ago, no longer mine to stand in. Because 3 weeks before she died, someone had gotten to her. And I had no idea until the attorney read the will out loud, and I watched a woman I had never met smile like she had just something she'd been, waiting for her entire life. Her name was Deanna. She was Margaret's biological daughter, and she had not spoken to her mother in 22 years. But she was there at the end, and apparently that was enough. I want to tell you what happened, all of it, because there is something you need to understand about patience. Real patience. The kind that costs you something, before I tell you how this story ends. Because it does end, just not the way Deanna planned. My name is Claire, and this is the story of how I lost everything in a single afternoon, and spent the next 14 months getting it back. Margaret found me when I was 26 years old. That sounds dramatic, but it's the most accurate way I know to say it. I didn't find her. She found me. I had just moved to the city for a job I was quietly terrified of. Junior coordinator at a nonprofit that worked with aging adults. It was my 3rd week. Margaret had come in as a volunteer. She was 64 years old, sharp as a tack, opinionated about everything, and completely incapable of not giving her honest reaction to whatever crossed her mind. She told me within the first 10 minutes that my filing system was chaotic and that I should reorganize it alphabetically rather than by date. I told her the system had been in place for 11 years and maybe she should ease into volunteering before she started renovating. She laughed so hard she had to sit down. That was how it started. Over the next 2 years, we became, I don't even know what the word is. Not friends exactly. Something older than that. She had lost her husband 6 years earlier. She had one biological daughter, Deanna, who had left for the West Coast at 23 and stopped calling around the time her father got sick. Margaret didn't talk about Deanna much. When she did, it was with a kind of careful neutrality that I recognized as the way you talk about a wound you've learned to manage. Not healed, just managed. I had my own version of that. My parents died within 14 months of each other when I was 19 and 20. I had spent most of my 20s being quietly untethered, functional, employed, but without the specific gravity that comes from having people who are yours. Margaret understood that without me having to explain it. We started having dinner together once a week, then twice. Then she was calling me on Sunday mornings to tell me about whatever book she'd stayed up reading, and I was calling her on Tuesday nights because something had happened at work that I needed to talk through with someone who would be honest. She started calling me her daughter. I told her that was a big word. She said she knew exactly how big it was, and she meant it precisely that size. By the time I was 29, Margaret had become the person I called first, before anyone else. When I got promoted, when I had a bad night, when I needed someone to look at a lease agreement and tell me if I was being taken advantage of, she was that person for me. And I was genuinely, truly that person for her. So when she called me at 31 and said the words, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to panic," I was already reaching for my keys before she finished the sentence. It was her heart. Not a heart attack, not yet. But the beginning of what the cardiologist called a progressive deterioration that would require, in his careful phrasing, increasing levels of support over time. He was a kind man who was trying not to say the harder thing out loud. Margaret had no patience for that. On the drive home from the appointment, she said, "I am going to need someone, Claire. I want that someone to be you, but I need you to know what you'd actually be agreeing to." I already knew. I knew because I had worked in care coordination for 5 years. I knew what progressive heart failure looked like at 18 months, at 3 years, at 5. I knew the trajectory. I knew the hospitalizations, the medications adjustments, the slow erosion of independence. The way someone who cooked elaborate dinners becomes someone who can't stand long enough to boil water, and how that transition is not a single moment, but 1,000 small losses compounded daily. I knew, and I said yes anyway. I want you to understand what yes actually meant. It meant I left my apartment in a city I loved. I packed my furniture into store and moved into Margaret's spare bedroom. It meant I renegotiated my position at the nonprofit to remote work, which they agreed to reluctantly, and with conditions that eventually led to me having to leave entirely when my hours became unpredictable. It meant I turned down a promotion that would have required travel. It meant I stopped dating seriously, because there was no room for seriously. My life had restructured itself around a schedule that belonged to someone else. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I need you to understand the factual reality of what I gave up and what I chose, because that distinction between sacrifice and choice is something I had to sit with for a long time. I chose this. I would choose it again. Margaret was mine and I was hers, and that was a real thing, not a transaction. But I also want you to understand what Deanna did not choose. Deanna did not come home when her father was sick. Deanna did not come home when Margaret had her first cardiac episode at 67. Deanna did not come home for any of the 11 hospitalizations over the 6 years I lived with Margaret. She sent a card at Christmas most years. Occasionally, she called on Margaret's birthday, though Margaret never knew in advance if she would. I know this because I was always there. I was always in the next room, or sitting across the kitchen table, or driving back from the pharmacy, and Margaret would sometimes mention it quietly. Deanna called this year, the same way you'd note the weather. Something that happened sometimes and didn't happen other times, and you'd learned not to make plans around. Deanna had 2 children Margaret had met a total of 4 times. I want you to hold on to that number. 4. I had been in that house for 6 years. I cooked her meals 7 days a week for the last 2 of those years, when her stamina dropped enough that standing was a project. I drove her to 43 medical appointments. I counted later. I had kept every receipt. I handled her medication schedule, her insurance disputes, her property tax appeal, the repair estimates for the furnace, the conversation with her primary care doctor about the DNR that she wanted to have and kept putting off. I held her hand through the procedure she was most afraid of. I was in the room. I was always in the room, 4 times. Deanna had been in her mother's life 4 times in 22 years. And then Margaret got very sick, the kind of sick that doctors speak about in weeks rather than months, and Deanna came home. I want to be precise about the timeline because the timeline matters. Margaret's condition accelerated in October. By November, the cardiologist was using language I recognized as the language of final stages. I had a conversation with her palliative care team. I had a conversation with Margaret. We talked about what she wanted. We talked about the house, about her belongings, about the things she had already put in writing. 3 years earlier, Margaret had worked with an estate attorney named Gerald Whitmore to update her will. I was not present for those meetings. I had offered to drive her, but she wanted to go alone, which I respected completely. She had told me afterward, quietly and simply, what she had decided. She said, "You are in it, Claire. You have been here. That is not something I take lightly." I did not ask for details. I did not ask for amounts. I want you to know that. It was not relevant to why I was there. I was not there because of what I would receive. I was there because she was as my family. But she told me, and I heard her, and I believed her. Deanna arrived in November, 2 weeks after Margaret's condition became critical. I remember the day clearly. I came home from the pharmacy. Margaret was still at home then, not yet in the hospital, and there was a rental car in the driveway, a silver one, parked at an angle, the way someone parks when they're in a hurry and not planning to stay long. She was already inside. Margaret had given her a key. Of course she had. She was her daughter, and Deanna was in the kitchen when I walked through the door. She was 39, tall, with Margaret's age same jaw and none of Margaret's warmth. She looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has walked into a room you are attempting to claim. She said, "You must be Claire," I said. "I am." She said, "It's nice to meet you, but I want you to know I'm going to be handling things from here." I remember standing in the doorway of a kitchen I had cooked in every single day for 2 years, holding a paper bag full of medication that would keep her mother alive for the next several weeks, and I felt something settle low in my stomach. Not fear exactly, recognition. I had seen this before, not personally, but in my work. The returning family member who had been absent for years and who arrived at end of life, carrying a particular kind of authority that had nothing to do with presence and everything to do with biology. The person who showed up in the final act and began narrating a role they had not played. I said, "I understand. Let me show you her medication schedule." She said she'd figure it out. I said, "She has 11 medications on a very specific timing protocol. 2 of them have interactions that her cardiologist specifically flagged. I've been managing this for 6 years. Please let me show you." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I appreciate everything you've done for her. I really do. But she's my mother." "Yes," I said, "she is." What happened over the next 3 weeks was something I have had to carefully reconstruct from memory and documentation. Because while it was happening, I was operating in the space between grief and function that caregivers enter near the end. You stop sleeping fully. You eat irregularly. You exist in a state of sustained alertness because you are always monitoring, always listening for the shift in breathing, always waiting for the next call from the hospital. I was in that state, and Deanna was not. She was fresh, energized even. She had arrived with the specific urgency of someone who had something to accomplish. And I was too exhausted to read that clearly enough, fast enough. She began spending long periods alone with Margaret, which was appropriate. She was her daughter. I did not interfere. I continued managing the medical side. I drove to the hospital when Margaret was admitted that final time. I sat in waiting rooms. But I began to notice things. The way Deanna would come out of Margaret's room with a particular set to her expression. Not grief. Something more calculating. The way she began asking questions about the house. Not the sentimental kind, the square footage kind. The way she introduced herself to the hospital social worker as the primary family contact, and the way the social worker wrote that down. I noticed, but I was so tired and Margaret was so sick. And there was so much that needed doing every hour that I did not stop and name what I was seeing. I should have. I know that now. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in early December. I was not in the room. I had stepped out to get coffee for the first time in 8 hours, and in the 12 minutes I was gone, she slipped away. Deanna was with her. I have made my peace with that. I have had to. The attorney called 3 days later. The reading of the will happened in Gerald Whitmore's office, a quiet, carpeted room with framed botanical prints that I would remember in strange detail afterward. Gerald was a man in his late 60s, careful and professional, the kind of attorney who speaks slowly on purpose. He read the new document in a measured voice. The will had been updated 3 weeks before Margaret's death. A codicil, a legal amendment, had been added superseding several previous provisions. The house, to Deanna. The investment accounts, to Deanna. The personal property, to Deanna. My name appeared once, in a clause that had been amended to read, to Claire, in recognition of her service, the sum of $5,000. Service. The word landed in my chest like something blunt. I sat very still. Gerald was watching me over his reading glasses, with an expression that was professionally neutral, but contained. I thought, a kind of careful apology. Deanna was looking at her hands, $5,000, for 6 years, for leaving a city, leaving a career, leaving a version of my life. For 43 medical appointments and 11 medications and the DNR conversation and the 3 a.m. calls and the roof repair and the insurance appeals, and the cooking and the driving and the staying when everyone else had the luxury of not staying. $5,000, and a note that said I was always just temporary. I stood up. I thanked Gerald for his time. And I walked out of the office with the specific, measured calm of someone who has already started planning. There are things you learn when you spend 6 years managing someone's medical and financial affairs. You learn the filing system. You learn where the documents are kept. You learn which drawer holds the warranty information and which one holds the insurance policies and which one holds the manila envelope that Margaret had labeled, in her handwriting, for Claire in the back of the second drawer of the filing cabinet in the study. She had shown me that envelope 18 months earlier. It was after a particularly hard week, a hospitalization that had scared us both, and she had sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "I want you to know where things are. I want you to know what I've done." Inside the envelope were several documents. One was a letter in Margaret's handwriting, dated, signed, witnessed by her neighbor Dorothy, that described our relationship in precise and loving detail. It described what I had given up. It described what she intended me to have. It described her wishes in language that was personal rather than legal. But it was witnessed, and it was dated, and it was in her handwriting. The second document was a caregiving contract. This was something I had suggested in year 2, gently, professionally, because I understood from my work background that informal caregiving arrangements often create legal ambiguities, and because I wanted us both to be protected. Margaret had agreed immediately. We had drafted it together with the help of a paralegal I knew through the nonprofit. It was a formal document that outlined the scope of my caregiving responsibilities, the compensation structure, which we had set as deferred, meaning I was not taking a salary, but had documented that the arrangement was intended to be compensated through the estate, and a specific clause about property rights. That clause stated that in exchange for long-term live-in caregiving, I had an established residential interest in the property that would require formal legal process to extinguish. The document was notarized. The third item in the envelope was a copy of the previous will, the one Gerald had prepared 3 years earlier, before the codicil, which named me as primary beneficiary of the house and 40% of the estate. I sat on the floor of the study with that envelope in my lap, and I understood something I hadn't been able to articulate in the 24 hours since the will reading. She had planned for me. She had thought about me leaving before she left. She had sat at her kitchen table, the one I cooked at every single day, and she had thought, what happens to Claire if someone tries to undo this? And she had built an answer. A notarized, witness-dated answer filed in the second drawer of the filing cabinet in the study. That envelope was not a legal document. It was a love letter. It just happened to be the kind that files a lien. I had not looked in that envelope in over a year. I had not needed to. I had trusted Margaret completely. But she had not trusted the world to honor that, and she had been right not to. I retrieved it the afternoon after the will reading. The house had not yet transferred legally. That process takes months. I still had my key. I walked through the front door, went to the study, opened the second drawer, and took the envelope. And then I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she came to me through a recommendation from a colleague at the nonprofit. A woman who had navigated her own estate dispute 2 years earlier and had described Patricia as the person you want when someone has tried to erase you on paper. I sent her the documents before our first meeting. When I walked into her office, she had them spread across the table and she was making notes in the margins, and she looked up at me with the focused expression of someone who has seen a case and recognized it. She said, "Tell me everything. Start with when Deanna arrived." I told her everything. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The codicil was executed 3 weeks before death. Your foster mother was in active end-stage cardiac failure at that time. She was on a medication protocol that included a sedative component for comfort. She was in the hospital for 11 of those 21 days. I said, "Yes," she said, "and you have a notarized caregiving contract with a deferred compensation clause and a residential interest provision." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you have a witnessed, signed, dated letter in Margaret's own handwriting, expressing her intentions regarding the estate." I said, "Yes." Patricia nodded slowly. Then she said, "Deanna made a mistake. She moved too fast, and she didn't check what existed before she arrived. People who come in at the end and try to redirect a will, they almost always make the same error. They assume the person they're trying to displace hasn't left anything behind. They underestimate how organized someone can be when they love someone enough to want to protect them." I said, "What do we do?" Patricia said, "We file a will contest on grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. We file a lien on the property based on the caregiving contract, and we request a full accounting of Margaret's condition and decision-making capacity during the 3 weeks the codicil was prepared." Then she said, "This will take time. Are you prepared for that?" I said, "I have been patient for much longer than this." The legal process moved in the way legal processes do. Not dramatically, not quickly, but with a kind of inexorable weight that belongs entirely to documentation. Patricia filed the contest in January. The lien went on the property the same week. This meant that Deanna could not sell, refinance, or transfer the house until the dispute was resolved. She had moved in, or tried to, and she received notice of the lien while she was still unpacking boxes. Her attorney called Patricia within 48 hours. What followed was 8 months of what I can only describe as the slow dismantling of Deanna's position. It happened piece by piece, document by document. The hospital records from Margaret's final 3 weeks showed that on the day the codicil was signed, Margaret had received an adjusted dosage of her comfort medication at 9 a.m. The codicil was signed at 11 a.m. Her cardiologist, who Patricia deposed, stated under oath that in his professional opinion, Margaret's cognitive capacity was significantly compromised during that period, and that he would not have considered her in a condition to execute complex legal documents without extensive evaluation. He had not been consulted. Gerald Whitmore, the estate attorney, was deposed as well. He was clearly uncomfortable. He stated that he had met with Margaret and found her sufficiently oriented to execute the document. When Patricia pressed him on what cognitive assessment tools he had used, he acknowledged he had used none, that it had been a brief meeting, and he had relied on his judgment. When Patricia asked who had arranged the meeting, he paused. He said, "The meeting was arranged by Ms. Margaret's daughter." Patricia said, "Which one?" A longer pause, he said, "Deanna." Patricia said, "Was Claire present or informed of this meeting?" He said, "I was not aware of a Claire at the time of the amendment." Patricia said, "You had prepared the original will 3 years earlier. In that will, Claire was named as primary beneficiary. How is it that you were not aware of her at the time of the amendment?" He said, "I was only informed that there was a new primary family contact." Patricia set her pen down on the table and looked at him and said nothing for a moment. He added quietly, "I see now that I should have verified further." "Yes," Patricia said, "you should have." The deposition of Deanna herself was the centerpiece. Patricia had spent 3 months preparing for it. She had documented every visit Deanna had made to Margaret over 22 years, 4 total, confirmed by Margaret's own calendar, her correspondence, and her neighbor Dorothy, who had known Margaret for 30 years, and who gave a voluntary statement that Deanna had not visited in over 7 years prior to November. She had documented the rental car receipts, the hotel bookings, Deanna's prior brief visits. She had the Christmas cards, saved in a box Margaret kept on the bedroom shelf, with their brief impersonal messages and their postmarks from cities that were never the city Margaret lived in. She had the caregiving contract, the letter, the original will, and she had something else. Dorothy, Margaret's neighbor, the woman who had witnessed the letter of 18 months earlier, had been home on the day the codicil was signed. She had seen a car in the driveway. She had found it unusual because Margaret had not mentioned visitors, and Dorothy and Margaret spoke almost every day. She had thought it was a medical appointment. She had not thought much about it. But she remembered it, and she remembered that Margaret had called her that evening. Margaret had been tired and a little confused. Dorothy had attributed it to the medication, and she had said something that Dorothy had thought was just fatigue-related rambling at the time. She had said, "I think I signed something today, Dorothy. I'm not entirely sure what it was." Dorothy had written that down in her personal journal that night because she had been concerned. She had not known it was relevant until Patricia called her. She brought her journal to the deposition. When Patricia read that entry aloud in the deposition room, Deanna's attorney asked for a recess. They came back 20 minutes later with a number. The settlement was reached in September. I am not going to give you every detail. Some of it is confidential by agreement, but I will tell you this. The house came to me. The original distribution that Margaret had intended, the one that reflected 6 years of presence, of love, of choosing to stay, was substantially restored. Deanna received a portion of the liquid assets. That was the compromise. Patricia had told me at the outset that full victory rarely looks the way you imagine it. That settlement is often cleaner than trial, and that the goal was not to punish Deanna so much as to correct what had been done. I had agreed. I believe now that was the right frame. But the house where I had lived and cooked and cared and stayed and stayed and stayed, that came back to me. I stood in the front hallway on the day the paperwork was finalized. Same hallway where I had read the note. Same light coming through the same window. The filing cabinet in the study with its second drawer. The kitchen where Deanna had looked at me like a stranger in my own home. It was quiet. I want to tell you what I felt, because people always ask, and I want to be honest. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel like I had won something. What I felt was closer to grief finally exhaled, the feeling of having held your breath for so long that releasing it is physically disorienting. I cried in that hallway, not out of happiness, out of something more complicated. Margaret was gone, and no legal document was going to undo that. And no settlement was going to give back the 6 years or the career or the version of my life I had structured around her. That was real loss. But the note, you were always just temporary. I want to say something about that note, because I thought about it for 14 months. I don't believe Margaret wrote it. I believe Deanna wrote it. I believe she put it in the envelope because she wanted me to feel what she needed me to feel: small, dismissed, replaceable. I believe it was a calculated cruelty designed to make me accept the outcome and walk away. I cannot prove that. It was never part of the legal case, but I know Margaret's voice, and that note does not sound like her. Margaret was blunt and honest, and sometimes difficult and occasionally infuriating, and she never in 12 years called me temporary. She called me her daughter. She called me the person who showed up. She called me once while she was in the hospital and frightened. The reason she wasn't afraid. I am not temporary. I was never temporary. I am the person who stayed. There is a version of this story where I become bitter, where the 14 months of legal process and exhaustion and the slow grinding work of fighting for what was already mine hardens me into someone who trusts less, loves with more conditions, calculates more carefully what she is willing to give. I understand that version. I have compassion for it. But that is not the story I chose to live. I stayed in the house. I repainted the kitchen. Margaret had wanted it a particular shade of yellow for years, but kept putting it off. I finished the garden she had started on the south wall. I have her books. I have her recipe cards in her handwriting. I have a photograph of the two of us from the year we met, when I was 26 and she was 64, and we were standing outside the nonprofit where she found me, both of us squinting into the sun, and she looks unbearably pleased with herself, because she always looked that way when she was right about something. She was right about me. I think about Deanna sometimes, not with hatred. I've worked on that, and I mostly mean it. I think about what it costs a person to become the kind of person who does what she did. The calculation she made. The assumption that love could be retroactively purchased in the final weeks of someone's life after 22 years of absence. The belief that biology entitled her to what presence had actually earned. I think about what she must feel, living with what she knows about herself now. That is its own kind of justice. And I think about Margaret. I think about the Tuesday morning in December when I was getting coffee and she was slipping away. I used to be racked with guilt about those 12 minutes. I have mostly made peace with it. I was there, truly there. For 190 days. I was there for every hard thing. I was there for the moments that mattered in the accumulating way that most moments do. Not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary ones. The Sunday mornings, the Tuesday nights. The meals and the medications and the drives and the conversations that had nothing to do with dying and everything to do with living. She knew I was there. She had left me the envelope. She had made her wishes known in the ways she was able. And when someone tried to take that away, the documentation she had signed and dated and witnessed was waiting, patient and precise and undeniable. She planned for me. She thought about me leaving before she left. That is love. That is the real thing. Not the biology, not the name on the birth certificate, not the rental car in November. The person who thinks about you even when you're not in the room. The person who makes sure, in advance, that you will be okay. That is what I carry. If you are watching this and you are the person who stayed, document everything. Not out of suspicion, out of love. Because real, lasting, protective love leaves a paper trail. The envelope in the second drawer was Margaret's love letter to me. It just happened to be notarized. And if the reading has already happened and the note is already in your hand, hear this. The ending has not been written yet. You are not temporary. You are the person who stayed, and that can be proven, submitted into evidence, and read aloud in a room where someone has to sit and listen. The people who showed up at the end made one mistake. They didn't know what you have in the second drawer. If this story is for you, share it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The people who stayed always deserve more than the people who came back. Always.